ロイタービジネスウィークリーのラシャ京子です。毎週アメリカ、特にこちらニューヨークで注目されたニュースをまとめてお伝えしています。今週はスタジオにイアン・ブレマー氏をお招きし、2012年どのような点に注目していけばいいのか見ていきたいと思います。Thank you very much for coming. First of all, in 2012, if there's three things we should focus on in the world affairs, what would that be?
Three things, just three, because, the world is blowing up around us. Well, one thing, of course, is going to be the Eurozone. It is not going to implode. It's not going to fragment. But it's not going to come to resolution quickly. And that lack of resolve, that lack of conclusion, is going to make markets around the world very, very unsettled. It's going to concern people about European banks. It's going to concern folks about a deeper European recession. It's the world's largest common economic space, so of course that's the first thing we worry about.
What is the role of the United States in this Euro crisis?
Well, it's willing to offer advice, but they're not going to fix Europe. This is what it amounts to. I mean, Geithner is not going to Europe and saying, we're going to provide the lion's share of funding. If you look at all of the financial crises that the world has been through over the past decades, the Russian crisis, the Latin crisis, the Asian crisis, what did they have in common? They all had in common the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, right? They all had in common the Americans coming in and figuring out a way to basically underwrite and create some rules. I assure you that's not happening in Europe. If Europe gets fixed, it gets fixed because of the Europeans. Sarkozy went to the Chinese and said, how about some help? The Chinese came back and they said, well, let's do it multilaterally, which is Chinese for no, right? They're not going to do it. No one else is fixing Europe. Not the Americans, not the Chinese, not the Japanese. It's the Europeans. And that G0 world is playing out in Europe today. Second thing we worry about is the broad Middle East. And it's the Middle East in the G0, a world without leaders. The United States has gone from Iraq. They're not playing the same role that they have historically in countries like Egypt or Syria or Iran. I can go on. But no one else is either, not the Chinese, not the Russians, not the Europeans. And unlike in Europe, where ultimately they can fix their own problems, in the Middle East they can't. The Saudi solutions, the Turkish solutions, the Iranian solutions are all different, and they're not coordinated. And so we see a lot more conflict as a consequence throughout the Middle East.
So what shall we do in this G0 world?
Well, this is the challenge of the G0. The G0 is not aspirational. The G0 is not providing solutions. The G0 is just where you are. And it does behoove. The first thing you need to do is understand it. So we should not pretend, we shouldn't fool ourselves that we have a roadmap for resolution of these problems, right? They are likely to get bigger. And so the first thing we have to do is prepare for a world where you're likely to have much more instability, especially in places like the Middle East. So if you're Japan, you need to think about where else your energy comes from. Over the long term, you need diversification. If you're the U.S., non-conventional oil and gas, Canada, Brazil, a lot more flexibility as a consequence. Look, there's a reason the United States doesn't want to play the role it did in the Middle East. It's not just because the U.S. wasn't being as effective. It's also because they understand that it's becoming a bit of a cesspool, right? And they don't want to get tarred with it. Obama wants to focus on things where he can have some wins. He's not going to get wins in the Middle East. It's very clear if the Americans aren't going to do it, others aren't either. And there will be multilateral local efforts. The Saudis are talking about creating some kind of a union out of the Gulf Cooperation Council, a smart thing for them to do, but something that is going to be very, very difficult to actually implement. But the third thing we pay attention to is global. It's the fact that politics is having so much more of an impact on economics and vice versa. And it's because in 2012, we're done with the 9/11 era. We've had a focus for a very long time now, the war on terror, national security, conventional security issues. Those are gone now. It's over. Bin Laden's dead. The United States is pulling out of Afghanistan. They're gone from Iraq. What are they focusing on? Asia. Why? Because economics is driving politics. And at the same time that economics is driving politics, politics is driving economics. What do I mean? emerging markets are where we get our growth. They're more unstable. In the developed world, we're waiting for political decisions before we're willing to make investment bets. And then globally, it's developed versus developing, U.S. versus China, creditor and debtors, and that rebalancing hasn't happened yet. So when you put it together, you get this confluence of politics and economics that makes us all much more uneasy about the global environment, makes it harder to get solutions to the challenges that face us. So 2012 is really a tough year in terms of global political risk.
Where the Japan is going to be in the world picture, world stage?
What to look at? Well, Japan is still a stable place. We've gone through this horrific set of catastrophes in Japan, and the Japanese have gotten through it. I say that thankfully, I say that respectfully. A lot of other countries in the world, most other countries in the world, could not have done that. And of course, there is a nuclear power shortfall, which has not been resolved, and that means that prices are going up in Japan. They're going up for Japanese citizens. They're going up for Japanese manufacturers. All of that is bad for Japan. But as you know, the Japanese hold their own debt. We have a prime minister now in Japan that has better approval ratings and more support from the Japanese population as a whole, as well as from the bureaucracy and from key industrialists. This is not a place that's going to see dramatic moves, either better or worse, in the coming year. So if something happens to Japan, it's external. It's because North Korea explodes. It's because the U.S.-China suddenly have serious problems. It's not because Japan is falling off the rails. 2012 is a fairly stable story for Japan.
Thank you very much for your insight. 今週は以上です。来週もロイターがアメリカのトピックスをまとめてお伝えいたします。ロイタービジネスウィークリーの馬車京子がニューヨークロイタースタジオからお伝えしました。それではまた来週。